Midrash, we were quoted the pasuk in Mishlei that Shlomo says, and the Midrash gave examples throughout history, that nivol lahon rav ayin ra, a person who's overwhelmed that he wants to amass greater wealth, usually it's associated with an evil eye. The person wants to take it all in. It's rooted in greed, and ultimately, not only does he not gain, he loses. We gave examples. Cain killed Hevel, his brother, because the world was not big enough for both of them. Ephron had the evil eye regarding selling Avram the Morsa Machpelah, the tomb of Machpelah, when he saw the level of wealth he had. Initially, he's giving it as a gift, and ultimately, he would not give it less than the most astronomical number. He sold it. And when he saw him piling out the silver and the degree of wealth he had, he couldn't contain himself. That was his level of envy. And ultimately, it shows that Mochrei Perish Shvius, you're not permitted to engage commercially in the produce of the sabbatical year. You're permitted to benefit from it as much as you want, but to deal with it commercially, to sell it, you're not permitted. And the person who does and justifies it, again, he figures he has all this inventory, which cost him nothing, and he starts selling it rather than gaining. Ultimately, it'll lead from one thing to another. He'll first sell his movables, then he'll sell his field, and then he'll sell his house, and then ultimately he'll have to sell himself into slavery, not only to a Jewish master, even to a non-Jewish master. It'll go from bad to worse unless he catches himself on the way down. But if he doesn't see the problem and recognize why things are deteriorating, ultimately he's going to hit rock bottom. Meaning he'll even sell himself, he'll be forced to sell himself to a non-Jew, which there he'll have to compromise his Judaism as a Jew. Of course, living under the control of a non-Jew, you can't live as an observant Jew. So there's a Gemara in Kedushin where the Gemara says, the Tanya Rabbi Yossi Reb Chanin Omer, Bo Rei Kamakosha Avka Shel Shvius. See to what degree how detrimental is even the dustings. The word avak means dust, the dust of Shvius. Odom nosei v'nosei beper Shvius. Person engages in transacting, selling the produce of Shvius. L'sof moches metaltlov. Ultimately, it's going to cause him to sell his movables. Shenemar, as it says in the parsha, b'shnas hayovel toshuv ish el achuzoso. We know in the Jubilee year, all the fixed properties that are sold, returned back, are returned to the original owners. And the Torah juxtaposes to the law of the fixed property returning if a person sells something to his fellow. You sell or you purchase. Something which is a mover, which is sold, goes from hand to hand. Lo hirgish, if the person didn't realize the cause of his problem, why he has to sell his movables. So if moches sadosov, ultimately he's going to have to sell his fields. Shenemar v'chiyomucha chicho, umocha me'achuzoso. When your brother becomes impoverished, and because of that impoverishment, he has to sell from his family heirloom, the fixed property. Lo bos liyodo. He still didn't realize it. He didn't get it. Ad shemoches beso. Until he's forced to sell his house, Shenemar, ki yimkar beis moshav irchoma. Maishno hosom dioma lo hirgish. O maishno hocha dioma lo bos biyodo. Lo bos. Initially, it says he wasn't sensitive. He had to sell his movables. He wasn't sensitive. Then it says lobos liyodo, meaning not he wasn't sensitive. Something else happened. He was forced to do the next thing. Kid Rav Huna, Domer Rav Huna, kevod she'ovar odom avero. This is an interesting concept. we find that a person, he transgresses once, v'shonabo, and he repeats that same sin over, hutralo, it becomes permitted to him. A person sins once, and then he transgresses a second time. Rav Huna says hutralo, the prohibition becomes permitted to him. So Mar asks, hutralo so kadaitoch, it has to become permitted. It's still forbidden. As the first time it was forbidden, the second time it's still forbidden. What does it mean, hutralo, it becomes permitted? Elo nasis lo keheter. Meaning, the way he perceives it, he doesn't see it any longer as he's doing the wrong. Nasis lo keheter. The first time you violate something, its temptation causes you to justify, to cross that line. After you cross the line, you realize you did the wrong thing. Something deliberately. You realize you did the wrong thing. And there's a certain degree of guilt, a guilt conscience. But if the person again was confronted with the same temptation, and he did cross the line a second time, he did not do tshuva after the first time, and he crossed the line a second time, not slow keter. He doesn't see it as wrong as the first time. The first time he never crossed this line. But for sake of temptation, he justifies, crosses that line, he transgresses. Now, again, he's confronted with that same level of temptation. And he crosses the line a second time. Once he crosses that line the second time, that prohibition is no longer seen as originally he saw that prohibition. He sees it in a context, it's okay. It's permitted. Now, how do we understand this? And that's what the Rav Huna, the way he expresses it. The first time it's lo hirgish. He wasn't touched. Wasn't touched meaning initially, but then afterwards, he should have been touched, and he crossed the line again. Once you cross that line the second time again, he doesn't see he's doing anything wrong any longer. I mean, consciously, knowledge-wise, he may know it, but he's not touched any longer. Why? Because once you cross the second time, you're a repeated offender, it becomes permitted to him. He sees it as something not forbidden. And that's a reality. I'll give you an example. A person in his life never ate non-kosher. Never ate non-kosher. And he's tempted to eat non-kosher. After he eats that non-kosher the first time, he has a very serious guilt conscience that he did the wrong thing. And he's touched. He's tempted again to do the same thing, and he didn't do tshuva after the first time. Once he does it the second time, the third time, it's no longer that difficult to do. It's already in his mind in a permitted context. And he doesn't have that guilt feeling any longer as he had the first time, that sense of guilt. What exactly is psychologically the whole discussion over here? You know, we find that there's certain characteristics which are innate to Jews. Rachmanim, because we are the descendants of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and this was Avram's innate characteristics. He was a Rachman. He had mercy. Rachmanim, Baishonim. Baishonim means they have shame, they have conscience, and Gomli Chasodim. And Jews do acts of loving kindness, Chesed. Why? Because Avram Avinu was the pillar of Chesed. Nobody could compare to him. We, being his descendants, we are heirs of those characteristics. But one of the characteristics is Baishonim. The value of Baishonim, of conscience, is so invaluable. You know, a human being, an animal, what actually keeps it in check? What keeps it in check is because an animal's function is based on instinct. An animal cannot behave differently than an animal is supposed to behave. The way it's programmed, that's the way it behaves. In this setting, it behaves this way. In another setting, it behaves differently. And certain things set it off. It's because regarding its wiring, its DNA, that's the way it's supposed to behave. A human being has choice. We have choice. So what keeps us in check that we don't cross many lines? There's something which is invaluable. It's called conscience. A human being, if you have a conscience, then you have a better chance of behaving appropriately and respectfully with integrity and not crossing the lines that you shouldn't cross because you have conscience. Because you have guilt, you can't live with yourself. There's no people in existence that have the conscience of the Jewish people. We have a conscience. It's called shame. The reason why you have shame is because you have conscience. As a result of that, there are many things Jews don't do, which the world does do, nations of the world do. Jews can't do. I mean, you find individuals, and the Gemara says in Yevamis that if you find a Jew who doesn't possess these characteristics, you have to question his pedigree, that initially he doesn't come from a Jewish source. His origin is not a Jewish, and therefore he doesn't have these innate characteristics. But because the Jew who does come from Avraham Yaakov, he's a pure pedigree, his pedigree is pure, he would possess these characteristics. But shame is key and fundamental to one's behavior. Now, there's no conscience as a Jewish conscience, and therefore you have shame, okay? What happens? You're tempted, and you cross the line, which is understandable. You're only human. And being human, Hashem says, no, you do tshuva. What about the person, rather than appreciating the wrong he did, he doesn't do tshuva. And he wants to go right back to do the same thing again. If he goes and does it a second time, he has to live with himself. He has to live with his conscience. How do you live with your conscience? The only way you can live with your conscience, because you have conscience, you have to somehow put it in a context to justify it. To see it, it's not so terrible. Because if you see it as wrong as the first time, you can't live with the guilt of the second time. So therefore, if you transgress the first time, you still have the sensitivity that you have the capacity to do tshuva because you have that sense of guilt because of your conscience. But if you did it a second time, it's not slow keheter. Because once you cross that line the second time, now the guilt should be overwhelming that you can't live with that guilt. So how do you reconcile the problem? You will leave the problem by putting it in a permitted context. It's not so terrible. That's how you do it. The Chafetz Chaim writes, he says, you could study Musar from today forever, and you revere God, but if you don't study the laws of what you're permitted to say, what you're not permitted to say, which are the laws of Lashon Hara, there are times where you may believe that it's a mitzvah to speak negative of certain people because the man is a Rasha. If a person is a Rasha, is an evil person, you're permitted to speak negatively about him because he's evil. A person goes where he should give a person the benefit of the doubt, and he does give that person the benefit of the doubt, which he should, and therefore he classifies him as a Rasha. Once he classifies him as a Rasha, the person believes carte blanche, he could say anything he wants about the man. But he made the mistake. Initially, when he saw him behaving a certain way, he should have given the benefit of the doubt, and he wouldn't put him in this negative column. He'd still be in the positive column. Meantime, it goes from bad to worse. Because of this, endless things pile up on it, because originally the foundation, the basis for this classification was incorrect. So he says, you believe you're the holiest man walking the face of the earth, and you believe you're doing mitzvahs, and everything that comes out of your mouth is Lashon Hara. So over there, we can't talk about conscience because you think you're doing the right thing. But a person wants to do the wrong thing because of your temptation. And your temptation wins out, and you do the wrong thing the first time. It's easy to do tshuva. It's easier to do tshuva because really the conscience really weighs on you. You have that temptation the second time, and you go and you justify doing the second time. The third time, when you do it the third time, you're barely touched by it because a Jew has such a heavy weight of conscience. Therefore, you rationalize and you justify it. And that's what the Gemara says over here. When you go, first you engage in Shvius. And you see, you get slapped on the hand. But the greed or the desire for money is so great, you continue doing it, the second thing happens. You have to sell your field. And if you don't wake up by the second time, it's a slippery slope. You go all the way down that slope. And ultimately, maybe when you hit rock bottom, when you can't deal with your situation, and in reflection, you realize the cause of everything was because you justified things which are unjustifiable. That's the reason. I once said, we find that Moshe Rabbeinu, the last 36 days of his life, he gives Musar, the Klal Yisrael, to the Jewish people, and he says to them, originally, he had sat and adjudicated all the cases of the Jewish people. Yisro comes, his father-in-law, and he observes what's going on, and he says to Moshe, what you're doing is not correct. novel tibol. If this is going to continue, you can become withered. It's impossible to continue this way. You have to create a judicial system with different echelons of judges, the various capacities, capabilities, and the most difficult case they'll bring to you, the lesser, less difficult, other people of lesser caliber will adjudicate. That's what he says. And the Jews said, they jumped at it. Rather than having Moshe Rabbeinu be the one to adjudicate it, the Jews were eager to embrace this. And it was a criticism, because Moshe says, who's it better to study Torah from? From the one who actually sacrificed for Torah, because it says 40 days and 40 nights, he did not eat bread or drink water, or of somebody who did not sacrifice. But yet you were eager. The answer is because you want the easy way out. Because me, you know that you can't hoodwink me. Therefore, you prefer the lesser judge, because with him you believe maybe you could bribe him, you could get away with things. With me, you know you can't get away with things. That was the rebuke. So there, when Yisro had suggested the caliber of the judge, he said one of the characteristics, the credential had to be chachomim. They had to be chachamim. What does it mean, a wise man? So Rashi over there cites the Targum. Chacham means people who have shame and conscience. That's chachamim. What a chacham is, you have an outstanding IQ, you have an intellectual capacity. That's chachamim. But Targum says no. You have shame. That's a chacham. A person that has no shame, you could be the greatest genius in the world, and there's nothing you don't know. But through which lens do you see it? You see through your own lens. That jaded eye, because you have no shame, so there's nothing you can't justify to do. So therefore, what is a chacham? The chacham is the person who has shame. Shame keeps the chacham in check. We find that the Torah juxtaposes Parshas Mishpatim, Eila Mishpatim, which is the law of setting up a judicial system, to the Mizbeach after Yisro. Why? Because where did the Sanhedrin, this is the High Court of Israel, where did they convene? In the chamber of cut stone, right alongside the sanctuary. Now the question is, what's the sanctuary? That's the Mizbeach. Right next to the Mizbeach, there was a line of demarcation. One side was the Sanhedrin, the other side was the Mizbeach. And the Sanhedrin of 71 judges, which were the greatest judges, they convened there. Why? So the way we explained it was, we find that rabbinic fences don't apply in the Beis HaMikdash. It's called Ein Shvus B'Mikdash. Rabbinic fences are not necessary. Why? Because when you walk in the Beis HaMikdash, you feel the presence of Hashem. So the whole concern that there may be a level of distraction and lack of cognizance, it has no relevance there. The reason why you make a fence is because a person doesn't have continuous cognizance of what he's doing, and you get distracted. Therefore, you need the fence to catch you, to keep the distance from crossing that line. In the Beis HaMikdash, because of the overwhelming sense of Kedusha, a person was always in check there because he felt Hashem's presence. The Sanhedrin, to be a member of Sanhedrin, you had to understand, minimally you had to understand 70 languages. You had to be proficient in the whole Torah. You had to know the laws of witchcraft and the laws of idolatry. You had to know everything. Because how do you evaluate what is and what's not? So we're speaking about a dimension of genius and knowledge which is not to be understood. How do you keep these people in check? If every human being has an ego, how do you keep that ego in check? If you have them right next to the Azorah, right next to the Mizbeach, where you feel and sense the presence of Hashem, when you're in the presence of Hashem, it's like we say, the most insightful person, like you have no brains. You're totally unintelligent in the presence of God. And you feel and sense that inadequacy. Therefore, as a result of that, now the Chocham is a Chocham, because you have a sense of consequence and understanding who you're not. So shame, to be a Chocham, you have to have shame. If you have no shame, you're shameless. There's nothing you can't justify in the most ingenious way. So that's what it says by Shvius. The first time, due to your desire to make money of greed, you cross the line, you sell your movables. When you notice that happening and you pick up on it, you have that sense you did something wrong, you do tshuva. If you don't do tshuva and you do it again, you lose that sense. Once you lose the sense, naslo keheter. because now you have to live with the wrong that you did, which you realize you did. Therefore, it's not loketer. Just to say the Rabbeinu Yonah writes in Shari Tshuva that if a person transgresses deliberately, Hashem is okay with it. Why? Because no human being knows the pitfalls of life until you experience life. So now all of a sudden you realize you're confronted with temptation, you couldn't deal with it, you violated the law. But now that you recognize your vulnerability in this area, how did you not make offense? The answer is that you feel it's not that important. As a result of that, it's a greater disrespect to God, so it could activate a wrath, because knowing now your vulnerability, how do you not take it into consideration? First time, you're innocent, you didn't realize what was around the corner. But now that you realize, how do you not live responsibly? That's Rabbeinu Yonah. And he quotes a pasuk in Mishlei that Shlomo Melech says in the Proverbs, when a person transgresses a second time, it's like a dog that eats something which is putrid, and it vomits, and then it goes and eats the vomit. Those are the words of Shlomo Melech. The Kelev Shav Keo. He returns and eats. So he explains, Rabbeinu Yonah, when the dog eats something putrid, it's putrid. It's something which is spoiled. But when he eats it and he vomits, it's even more disgusting, more detestable, more putrid. And he goes and eats it the second time. Same thing. The first time you sin, it's wrong. It's the wrong thing. But now that you understand your vulnerability, and despite that you don't take the precaution to do it the second time the claim is a stronger claim against the person. Because now that you know, how did you not take the precaution? The answer is it shows a greater disregard for God, therefore the claim against the person is a greater claim.